So with that said, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Effective Disaster Recovery and Business Continuity Planning. We are very excited to talk about this topic with our featured panelists. I'm Joel Anderson, the VP of Marketing here at Tier4 Advisors. We will be recording this session, so it will be available after the webinar today for rewatching, redistribution. So please keep an eye out for that you will receive a copy. We are excited to have Jake Sherrill, our founder and chairman, hosting the webinar, along with our expert panelist, Dreher, Director of Solutions Engineering at Greenhouse Data, Alvaro Gonzalez, Area Vice President, Partner Strategy and Enablement at TierPoint, Derrick Dike, Director of UCaaS at BCM One, and Eric McVey, CIO at Tier4 Advisors. If you do have a few questions that you'd like to participate and ask the panelists, please wait until the end, but you do have the ability to ask those questions via the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, Jake, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of those who are attending. We have the largest group of attendees thus far, and for our short webinar series that we have started recently here at Tier4. Want to introduce our panelists and get a background on who they are and what they do. So Dreher with Greenhouse, please start. We'll start with you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dreher. I'm the Director of Solution Architecture with Greenhouse Data. Been with the company about 5 years and have almost 3 decades of experience within the industry. For those that have never heard of Greenhouse Data, we are essentially a digital transformation partner. We help our clients or organizations navigate a cloud journey. Think of things such as workplace modernization, applications and infrastructure, consulting, development operations or DevOps, and even some of the traditional facets of IT, such as co-location. If you wish to get a hold of us towards the end of the webinar, please feel free to do so through our partners at Tier4. Thanks, Jake.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Appreciate it. Alvaro Gonzalez with TierPoint.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. I am the AVP of Partner Strategy and Enablement at TierPoint. For those of you not familiar with us, we are a data center and cloud services company operating 40 data centers in 20 markets all across the nation, and with a very broad set of capabilities that let us probably kind of like what Stephen was mentioning, kind of engage with really complex customer problems ranging from co-location through hosted private clouds, multi-tenant clouds, IBM services, and a whole set of capabilities around it to get after business outcomes. So pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Alvaro. Derrick Dike with BCM One.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derrick Dike. I'm the Director of UCaaS with BCM One. BCM One is a Tier 1, a reseller of many Tier 1 providers, wholesalers. I have been brought in recently as of last year to run their UCaaS division. We've made some significant acquisitions and purchases, and we have drastically grown our UCaaS practice, and we have some more acquisitions and plans in place and investments for that. So that is my role with the company and how we partner with Tier4.
Thank you, Derrick. And last but not least, Eric McVey, our global CIO here at Tier4 Advisors. Eric?
I'm muted. Joel said to stay on mute until I came on, and I forgot that part. So I'm Eric McVey, the CIO of Tier4. Been with Tier4 since 2016 after a long and storied career in IT for 30 plus years with Fortune 50 companies and running global operations for all of those. Came to Tier4 in 2016 and haven't looked back. So happy to be here, and thank you again of our partners for being here today.
Excellent. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So again, the title of today's panel discussion is Effective DR and BC Planning. We want to talk about what disaster recovery is and what that should mean for you. Also, what business continuity is and what that should mean for you as well. So let's go ahead and start with the definition, shall we? Disaster recovery, DRaaS, DR as a service, and business continuity. Stephen, do you want to go ahead and jump into that? What is the difference between all three of those, and why should we care?
The differences are actually quite stark. I'll go ahead and start with the bottom, and that is the business continuity. Sometimes this is referred to as operational continuity, and specifically that is where an organization gets into a lot of the mission critical and key essential functions of the business, and so it's not specific around technology. We all know that technology plays an important role in many organizations. However, when we start talking about the business function, oftentimes that gets into the people, that gets into the processes, and that gets into the tools. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is starting to get much more specific into the IT realm, if you will. At the end of the day, what we're really doing is we're covering risks to essentially those key essential functions. And so we'll look at that from the support tool perspective, applications, data, collaboration, workforce displacement, et cetera. And then lastly, disaster recovery as a service, just like as the name implies, it is effectively leveraging a service provider or a partner to help in those activities. That can range anything from essentially the strategic aspects, in other words, the planning, the visioning, all the way up into including tool selection, and then subsequently leveraging a provider to actually execute on those services. And so that may include failover operations, it may include testing, and so on.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Stephen, I was going to ask Stephen just a quick question. Can you have one without the other?
Oh, I think you certainly can. For example, just looking at disaster recovery, everybody can have a failover plan. In other words, IT is looking great, data is being replicated. But if, just like we're experiencing in today's times, when all of a sudden you have a tremendous workforce displacement, that can eliminate a lot of shortcomings in disaster recovery, if you will, from, again, that operational perspective. So just because you have the tools doesn't necessarily mean that you have the processes in place to be able to execute on those tools. And then, of course, lastly, being able to adapt.
Yeah, you can, but you're not going to like it.
That's exactly where my head was. You can have DR, and as former admin, we like to say we wanted to design so we're not getting that phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. More importantly, the CIO's not getting that call at 3 o'clock in the morning. But you can't have a business continuity plan without a proper DR plan. Was where I was going with that.
Yes, certainly when we start looking at how technology is leveraged, particularly across, I can't tell you of any business that doesn't use it in some shape or fashion. Whenever there's a displacement, and that interruption can be something from a natural cause, it could be something that was unforeseen, such as like a fire, anytime we have to protect at least the ways that the businesses function, and then of course people's access into information and the tools to do their job plays a critical factor in that.
Excellent. Great feedback, guys. So let's go ahead and spend a couple minutes on business continuity for now. Eric, we'll start with you on this one. What are the deadly sins of business continuity programming? What do you want to bring up for the group? You're on mute again, sir.
I'll get the hang of this here, guys. My mother said I have a face for radio, so this video thing has got me a little squirrely, but anyway, we've done several business continuity planning sessions with a lot of our clients, and what we tell them is that this is not a one and done kind of thing. This planning has to be continually updated because you're getting new applications every day, you're getting new processes every day, and so it's a living, breathing document. And one of the deadliest sins is to, check that box. Okay, I got a business continuity plan, and then go put it on the shelf when it's gathering dust, right? So if you're not pulling that playbook out and testing it once a quarter, twice a year, what have you, and a lot of people will call that a tabletop exercise, right? If you're not doing that, then the plan is virtually useless. In a lot of I know many of those out there on the phone today, working in office buildings. What do? Once a quarter, they're doing fire drills. So they're practicing that plan of how to get you out of the building safely. The other point I wanted to bring out was if you're not in a TierPoint or you're not in a greenhouse data site and you're running your own data center, on-prem or where have you, make sure your suppliers, you have service level agreements with your suppliers as part of that plan. You may have generator, may have batteries for your UPS, but if you don't have a SLA with those vendors, of 4 hours or what have you, you could be left in the lurch if your building's going to be down and out for more than a couple days. So anyway, we'll start there, and I'll throw it to Alvarez or Stephen.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd follow on to that to say, just as Eric was saying, that you see a lot of times people think they can have a business continuity plan without thinking very hard about the disaster recovery, or like I have misspent youth, being an SE and a seller for a bunch of different technology companies. And you see sometimes too, people do the opposite, and they'll do a disaster recovery plan in a silo, and they never ask, how does this interact with business continuity? So I think in general, really the deadly sins are people don't think about it hard enough. They do think they're going to check a box and it's good, but you don't get together to talk with all the stakeholders, and people lose sight of the fact that like disaster recovery maybe is how, disaster recovery as a service in particular is a how, a business continuity is a what, but people need to account for the why, because without the why, none of it matters. And the why is, how do I defend my business? How do I stay up and running, meeting the needs of my customers? And people who try to be superficial or sort of round corners about any part of that chain, I think get in trouble. And actually, Eric, you mentioned fuel contract, or you mentioned SLAs in particular for those people who operate their own data centers. Data center business, fuel contracts are crucial. Battery maintenance, crucial. What's of the maintenance and the testing and the load capability of your cooling infrastructure? There are all of these things that are kind of fiddly details that service providers worry about all the time. And we see that, businesses operating their own facilities don't get experience as fast as we do, and they fall into those holes, and it's painful when they get on the wrong side of that.
You're exactly right. And, I'm fascinated by how many businesses have not taken into account the communications aspect of business continuity as well, right? We can talk about disaster recovery, and we're going to get into that here in a moment. But with regards to, Derrick, this next question we'll start with you. With regards to communications, I mean, a week and a half ago, my son dropped her cell phone, and it broke so bad that her screen wouldn't turn on. And we called Verizon. Hey, Verizon, you're our cell phone carrier, have been for a decade. We need a new phone. Verizon didn't have anybody available. They said, because of COVID-19, our call centers are either shut down or whatever it was. Long story short, we couldn't get through to anybody. It's shocking to see how many call centers, what type of communications are, if not down, heavily impacted with something like COVID-19. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Derrick, and what maybe some strategies are going forward for some of these companies to talk about collaboration, communications, call center, et cetera?
Absolutely, thank you. So we have been working nonstop for the past three to 4 weeks on exactly that situation. You're right. It is surprising how many companies, especially call center companies, that were not really at all prepared for this. We did a turn up of a 200 user call center in 36 hours because it was a healthcare. It was a healthcare company that had to be up and running, and they didn't care how much it cost. They didn't care what it took. They utilized us to do that, and that's just one of probably 25, 30 examples that I can give you where we've been going through that process of these companies who just were not prepared for that. The biggest thing is, when you look at DR from your communication standpoint, is how does your call flow work today, and what does that look like if I don't have this office running? The companies that are on pure prem-based solutions, where, okay, we need to have a person at home and I need to create a VPN to get them up and running. That's fine doing it once here, once there. When you're all of a sudden doing it for, you know, several hundred employees at the same time, now can your network infrastructure, your IT infrastructure take all of those VPNs at the same time? That was a big wake-up call to a lot of customers that we saw. And I think the realm of hosted is really taking the forefront, taking the lead on that, and resolving a lot of those issues that, quite frankly, no one was really looking at from a prem-based solution.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Obviously, we have some feedback here.
Was that on my side?
I don't know. Stephen, next question is for you. We're going to go ahead and pivot into some DR.
Excellent.
Let's talk about RTO and RPO and why that matters, shall we?
Okay, you bet. So RTO and RPO are essentially acronyms, and they have to deal quite a bit as it applies to both not only backups, if you will, but disaster recovery. And they are the two, although they both kind of inclusive, if you will. The slight differences are when we start talking about a recovery time objective, that T in there means that we're essentially racing a time clock, or the organization is racing against time, which can become of the essence, of course, simply if we start looking at things like the comment made earlier where, you start looking at the cost of downtime. So from a time perspective, it bakes in it's much more of a general purpose when it comes into the continuity management. And then when we start getting into the recovery point objective, we're pivoting slightly, and we're talking about specifically like more transactional, if you will. So a great example of this is if from a DR strategy, we know we have a recovery time objective of, we'll just say 4 hours. And so in other words, we want to have all of our mission critical functions up and operational within 4 hours. That's an established time frame. And so then we align tools and processes to be able to accommodate that. When we start looking at a recovery point perspective, or recovery point objective, if you will, we might be focusing on what kind of information can we sustain from a data loss perspective. That could be anything from just a credit card transaction. It could be a data handoff or some sort of integrated transaction that applies to data, et cetera. And so when we start looking at it from the RTO perspective, that time objective, we're really aligning the cost of downtime, and we're basing that against a time clock. From a recovery point objective, it's the minimum tolerance that an organization has for a specific workload for things such as transactional data, if you will.
Good, that's perfect. And when we talk about a secondary site, when we talk about a disaster recovery infrastructure footprint, Alvaro, we'll come to you on this. Do we need an apples to apples with our primary for our secondary? Can we get away with something different? How do we figure that out?
Yeah, so I mean, let me start by picking up where with what Stephen was saying, that essentially I would say RTO is a function of your compute or your storage stuff, and so this will have to do with what kind of infrastructure you need. RPO usually is a function of the network that's tying your source and your target environments together, because that is how close can you afford to keep those two things together. So now when you get into, do I need to have a full apples to apples same setup? One of the reasons why so many people have totally deficient disaster recovery plans even now is because it used to be that effectively was what people thought. And what it meant was then that disaster recovery planning was crazily expensive. It was potentially as much as 125% the cost of production, because you needed the same stuff, and you needed the transport, and you needed the place to put it. Now, though, there are so many people who do great work in this, and I'm sure, Stephen, I'm sure can give color in this as well, that you have the different tiers of category of application from tier 0 to tier 3. Usually 0 is the most important, and you can shape up then infrastructure and sync schedules to have our tier 0 applications be running on the strongest, the best infrastructure with the least period of time to get back up and running and data loss. But lower end applications, one example would be, internal wikis and things like that. You can have those be a very low profile thing, but potentially you could even restore them out of just backups. There's a whole spectrum that allows you to shape up what you're spending with the importance or the ROI that you would get out of that business continuity outcome, right?
Yeah, Alvaro, I would actually.
No, you don't, right? Yeah.
I was just going to kind of take that one step farther, and you start looking at it from what we do with Greenhouse Data is we look at it from a recovery service level, and what that can mean is essentially instead of having an exact duplicate, we'll just pick on premises for example, just because we all know CapEx is expensive, but having to duplicate that in another facility from a disaster recovery perspective is usually cost prohibitive, as you had mentioned. When you start looking at things like an RSL, maybe we're aligning that with our key essential functions. So that may be an application, it may be specific workforce. Nobody wants to not get a paycheck, for example, and so oftentimes when you see a traditional, smoke and rubble scenario, payroll is one of those things that typically comes first. But the point is that being able to scale that back, in other words, it's not necessarily an apples of apples. We can look at things such as compute reduction. Certainly, connectivity might be one of those things that in any capacity may be a little bit more difficult, I guess you could say, or challenging. But being able to parse through that organization as well. Sorry, I think I stepped on your toe a little.
No, totally agree. Like that's the thing, right? That's why there's such good work being done in this right now. It used to be that there were only blunt instruments. Today, that's not the case anymore.
So we agree that disaster recovery is important. We also agree that business continuity is important. Let's talk about getting a disaster recovery program set up. If we wanted to, look at going from nothing to something in the DR realm, Stephen, we'll start with you. How long would something like that take? I mean, how long would it take to go through the exercise of understanding what needs to be considered a tier 1, 2, or 3 application, and all the way through testing, perhaps?
No, that's a great question, and a lot of times this is where the appearance of having that, it's going to be insurmountable. So to bluntly answer the question, it depends. If you're dealing with a large organization that is very siloed in the context of how various departments have interactions, they may be leveraging different applications. That can certainly add size, if you will, or scope or duration. But by and large, being able to align that, typically with Greenhouse Data, we'll actually put what we call our Spotlight Discovery on the front end of that, and that's to do two things. One, it's to build an acclimation between us as a partner and the organization. What are their processes? What do their workflows look like? What are the expectations that they have out of disaster recovery? A lot of times you can find malalignment with that, where, for example, you might have all of the C-suite, if you will, thinking DR is just having a copy of backup data someplace. But when you start moving down into the workforce, it's how are they going to interact with that as well. So the tools, the time frame, that part can depend a little bit just on the size of the organization, the complexity, the dependencies that are there. But as soon as we get that up and going, really the deployment of said tools and being able to test that in a real world scenario, if you will, can actually be a function of weeks, if you will. A lot of times that may just be inclusive of a few workshops to become 1 or 2 applications, or in other words, what's that going to look like in a strategic perspective, and then we boil that down and align the tools with it. But long-winded response to answer you, it depends. The tools from a deployment perspective can be a matter of hours. Then, of course, the exercising and remediation exercises that often transpire through things like orchestration could take a little bit longer as well.
Jake, I'm going to jump in there just a second. We've got a point on this later on, but I think it's appropriate to interject it now. As cliche as it sounds, it does depend. And one of the dependencies is the executive sponsorship. How important is staying up and running to the executives? If you have that executive buy-in, then it becomes a priority for the people that are actually setting it up. You get to go through and look at the HR people, the finance people, and the sales teams, because downtime means something different to every one of those. We used to say, it's just development, it's down. Well, development is production to a developer, right? So it's kind of important that they're not coding if their systems aren't up, right? So having that executive sponsorship pushing down and go, this needs to be a priority, let's make it so. And here's my accessibility and buy-in.
Yeah, I would actually kind of tail off that as well. One of the organizations that, that I've had the pleasure of dealing with, they're in the mortgage service business. And essentially they have, call it 600 or so agents in the traditional fashion, basically processing loan applications. And if there is a disruption in technology, now all of a sudden the workforce, meaning 600 people, are unable to actually execute their job. And so that really plays into the aspects of, you know, not only why it's important, but how to get that executive buy-in. And you'll hear probably throughout this entire webinar where we start to talk about that mean cost of downtime, if you will. Like, in other words, if an organization hasn't actually looked at it by the numbers, in other words, what does the salaried workforce of 600 people cost at the end of the day, all because of say like some sort of a patch update that went awry.
Yeah, absolutely. That's perfect. So let's talk about, you know, building a business continuity plan. What does something like that take? The short answer on DR was it depends. But if you had to move quick enough, you know, or if you had to move right away, you could do it, you know, in a matter of a few weeks, at least having some sort of testable disaster recovery footprint up and running. Let's talk about business continuity. What does the length of a project look like there? And is there a finish line, or is it kind of what Eric touched on a little bit earlier, where it's a living, breathing document and it's always changing, and it's something you have to look at maybe quarterly or at least semi-annual?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there, Jake. And so when we start looking at it from essentially a planning perspective or an exercise, it's really important to become acclimated with what is the organization's key essential functions. What are the parts that how does the business generate revenue? What are the tools and the applications that go into supporting that? In other words, what we're really looking for is alignment. The next part that comes onto that as well is compliance. So in other words, we may be dealing with, we'll just pick on healthcare for a second. There may be HIPAA involved with this as well. And so we have to take into consideration factors of encryption at rest and encryption in transit. And so data that's moving from point A to point B, even in a DR scenario, specifically for leveraging third-party providers or hyperscale, these all play into that planning exercise, if you will.
Yeah. I will follow on to that and just say, you know, actually, one of the things that I think has really revealed itself in the course of stuff that's going on right now, and I'm sure we're going to come around to this topic, is all kinds of people have, I think, done a pretty decent job of what I would call like the DR side of it, and that is the technology side. Mm-hmm. How many people had a great plan for the interface between what I would call DR and business continuity, and that is, when all of my workers went off site, I didn't have enough network upstream bandwidth out of my own data center to handle the traffic. My firewall couldn't scale to handle the number of VPN connections. That's kind of on the, you know, the edge of business continuity, disaster recovery. Business continuity, what do I do when the people cannot go to the building to maintain the infrastructure anymore, or any of the rest of this stuff? That actually, I think, that's been one of the great learnings, I think, of this experience now, is that generally across the board, people have done an okay job of this. They failed to account, though, for some of these things that we're seeing now. And then, Derek, you know, I have misspent youth also as a seller, as an SE, doing voice and network applications also. And boy, you want to see some unhappy people, take a DS3 worth of dedicated LD down, you know, when they're a contact center. You probably could tell some, you know, have some insight into that as well, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, it starts from the little things as well. What we found aren't able to handle multiple inbound calls on a soft phone. There's numerous examples like that, where it's one thing to just think, well, yeah, we can just remotely do this, but touching off of Stephen's point earlier, you truly have to look at it from a department to department standpoint. It can't be a decision that IT makes and decides it for the entire organization. It truly has to be designed of how do we function today, what can we live without, what can't we live without, and look at it from, tackle those what can't we live without, and how do we make that redundant.
Real world example. Think about, okay, as an executive, you're saying, okay, all my folks have laptops, right? And oh, by the way, they're secure. And you go home and part of their function is printing, and they're not an admin of their own laptop. So how do you address that so they can install their home printer, right? So it's real world things you kind of have to walk through, business processes that you have to duplicate as if you were sitting in the office.
Well, just to double down on that, Eric, it's interesting to say, but it's the truth that a lot of these businesses are being ran remotely, obviously, right now. You have executives that are sharing the same Wi-Fi as their child is watching, God knows what on their, Kindle or their iPad or whatever. What are some of those business conversations that you could have in that business continuity conversation or overall, planning session that, maybe some folks, even on this webinar, haven't thought about?
So, Jake, this is Stephen, and we had kind of touched on this earlier, but oftentimes that discussion, it can be very far-reaching, and you have to be very careful with that just to make sure that we're actually talking about not all of the nuances, but taking care of essentially the meat and potatoes of the organization. We had looked at it from the cost of downtime, so in other words, actually putting the math behind it. In other words, that, if you will, kind of turns into a fiscal conversation. There are risks to the organization, so if you start looking at, say, for example, a data estate, what can happen if you have discontinuity between your data sets? I'm thinking kind of in a larger organization, if you will, where all of a sudden data doesn't match from site A to site B. When you start looking at that, other aspects that typically fall into that conversation that not a lot of people think about are the dependencies. And so if you start looking at things just like what the times that we're living in today, where the majority of the workforce is displaced, things like identity and security come into play. We start looking at things like, well, how do you deploy a bring your own device? So in other words, people can bring their home computers and all of a sudden can be functioning at their job. And so a lot of these different areas play a part in that discussion. And then of course, the last one, of course, is what are the next steps that usually involved? Oftentimes most organizations have some real low-hanging fruit. It could be a particular workload or application that they just want to make sure is sealed up. So in other words, it kind of gets a lot of value from the implementation perspective as well.
Perfect. Derrick, and you were kind of touching on this a little bit, but if the phone system is on-prem at someone's HQ, let's say, and they don't have it necessarily backed up anywhere, do you mind talking about, what options are out there? Just overall, what options do we have?
Sure. Before I get into the options, let's talk about some of the examples, real-world examples that I've come across where some of the pitfalls. If it's a prem-based solution on-site, and they need to forward their numbers to either another solution or cell phones or whatever that might be, but then they realize they can't do call forwarding with multiple paths. And all of a sudden now that you're getting one call through and busy signals for the rest because it's not hitting your PRI correctly. We've seen a lot of strange, not strange, but a lot of issues like that. Where emergency ports are being requested. It's those types of things that you have to look for. It depends on your prem-based solution that you have today and what capabilities are out there for you. I ran across one recently where they were essentially opening up ports on the phone system to allow people remotely to connect, to take their phones home and to connect directly to the prem-based solution. To me, that's a huge red flag. I have an entire engineering team where part of their job is to constantly manage threats and security. We have our data centers locked down. in so many ways, so that, you know, to try to negate any threats or as many threats as possible, because we can see every day how many people are trying to hit our data centers. When I heard that was the recommendation, that they were able to do that functionality on this particular PBX, it shot up a tremendous amount of red flags to me, because that is not a viable solution for disaster recovery. That not only do you not have the redundancy built in, but I guarantee you do not have the security that you think you have trying to do that. So again, depending on the solution, the PBX you have and what its capabilities are, they all present their own challenges, and it's kind of a case by case basis. What we are seeing in this interim is companies are looking to us and other companies as well to set up month to month, where they are doing call forwarding, they are deploying soft phones and working on a month-to-month basis in order to weather the storm, so to speak. And unfortunately, those were the only solutions that they had available to them. So, you know, again, it really depends on the system itself, what its capabilities are, what its call forwarding looks like, and soft phone capabilities. But, you know, just opening up your PBX to allow services, people to connect in, I think is a recipe for disaster, and we're going to see a lot in the next 30 to 60 days. We're going to hear a lot of stories about compromised systems, international, you know, waking up or coming into work on Monday and realizing you've got $50,000 in international run-up. I mean, these are real-world examples that I think are very, very possible to happen.
And actually, you know, I just was on a call the other day, a roundtable with some executives from around the country, and the most chilling but interesting thing anyone said on the call was the CTO from a law firm specializing in handling when you have to disclose having been breached. This was 10 days ago now. He said the phone is already ringing off the hook because people went into this with insufficient plans. Change management, like open the ports on your PBX, went out the window. And now there are massive, massive security issues. And these are just the ones who know so far. And it is like a COVID situation there. 10% know. That doesn't mean that 90% didn't get hosed up because they failed to plan. So change management was bad. You know, that's, yeah.
Absolutely. Completely agree with that assessment.
Yep.
And Derrick, obviously in times like these, you know, sometimes project deadlines or time frames get shuffled, moved up, postponed, or shelved entirely. Are you seeing an uptick in clients coming to you saying, hey, I need to have this system yesterday? Or are you seeing more delays because people just don't have the time to address it?
No, we are definitely seeing an uptick in clients coming to us saying, what can you do to get us up tomorrow? That has been, the last 3 weeks has been pretty nonstop with that single request right there of what can I do? So if there's anyone on this webinar that's in that same boat, know that you're not alone. There are options out there that can be done. But we've definitely seen that over projects being delayed by all means.
And we talked about DRAS, you know, being weeks, talked about business continuity being weeks, months, living document. Looking at the notes here, I mean, just out of curiosity, again, if there is someone on this call and they need to have, you know, CCaaS, contact center as a service spun up for, you know, a few dozen folks or even a couple hundred folks, and they've got, you know, a dozen or a couple hundred employees working remotely. Can you give us an idea? I mean, is this a 3-day project or is this a 3 to 6 month project?
No, it is, again, it depends on the application itself and what's involved in the requirements. Are there call centers set up? How advanced are the call centers that we're trying to replicate? Are we shipping equipment out to all the locations? one of the things that we've started embracing is the Wi-Fi capability of some of the phones now, some of the IP phones, because again, another miss that happened was, the IT team thought, well, yeah, everyone can just take their phones home. Well, not everyone's office is next to their router that they can plug their RJ45 connection, and their printer, their laptop runs on Wi-Fi. They have to be able to use that phone the same way. So it's a lot of when planning for this, that's why it's so important to work with a partner like Tier4 to really have someone who's kind of thought through all of these nuances. In terms of getting back to your original question, in terms of turnups, like I said, we did a case study. We turned up a 200-seat call center within 36 hours. It's in the past, installations have taken longer because it's been difficult for us to get information back from the customer. That has not been the case during all of this. The information we've asked for, we've gotten immediately, and we've acted upon it. So it's something generally under a week that we can easily get turned up.
And for the attendees, we're winding down here in the next 5 to 10 minutes, but feel free to keep those questions coming. I see them coming in through our chat feature, so I appreciate that. I'm going to do my best to answer as many of these as I can. One of the questions that we had, and Alvaro, we'll start with you, and then Stephen, please chime in, is a public hyperscaler the ideal compute scenario for DR? Does it make more sense today than it did before, or is virtual public, virtual private, dedicated private make more sense for a DR and also a DRaaS type of offer?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think that, so many of these questions, right, you have to start by saying it depends. It depends on what the source environment is that you're trying to protect. If you have kind of a born in the cloud kind of situation where your applications are set up to be very friendly going into the hyperscale kind of environment, that you don't have to refactor them, that the performance isn't going to be really different because of something else, then that can be a pretty good fit. For a lot of people, that's not the case. Something, for example, at a TierPoint, we've been doing a lot of great work with lately has been people actually who have a couple different compute platforms, some of it x86 stuff, usually on VMware. And maybe, you could do a VMware on AWS kind of a play in that environment. But a lot of people as well have line of business applications, for example, that are on an I-series, a P-series, AIX on Power, Linux on Power, even IBM Z-series. At that point, I would say that no, the hyperscale thing kind of goes straight out the window, simply because usually the IBM and the non-IBM workloads have interdependencies in your production environment. You want to keep them together. People who try to break those things apart, it's like we started, you can have BC without DR, you can have DR without BC, but you're not going to like it. Breaking those sorts of things apart, you're not going to like that either. So if your source looks like that, you can use it, and that can be a good option. If your source doesn't look like that, chances are it's not going to be a good option. You can do it, but you'll probably pay a price in RTO and RPO. So, it just depends on what the business is, but more than it used to be, less than some people want it to be is probably like the summary answer.
Fair.
Steven,
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Stephen, what else you got?
I was just going to say that it has an awful lot to do with the workloads, as Alvaro had articulated. If you have things that are prohibitive, such as like the IBM Power Series, you might as well go out and buy a boat at that time because you've got the anchor already.
You'd be surprised, my friend.
is the hyperscale provider a suitable fit? And the short answer to that is you bet. And not only are they a fit, but they also bring tools that the vast majority of organizations would be able to capitalize on. Just picking on Azure, for for a moment, for example. So there are cloud native tools that essentially allow customers to take virtual workloads, so in other words, VMware, Hyper-V, etc., and be able to replicate them up to a hyperscale platform. And the benefit that we oftentimes see with that is that, you know, they're not consuming the resources like you would traditionally think of in a DR context requiring two of everything. So in other words, we've got the data, we've got the virtual instances already in the cloud at that point. All we're talking about is literally some orchestration to be able to bring it online. And of course, most of the hyperscale providers, in fact, all of them, bring together the automated tools to be able to assist with orchestration, whether or not that is something that's baked into the cloud native application or it's a third party as well. Most come to the table with the ability to be able to execute in that hyperscale capacity. In fact, I don't know of any that are in the magic quadrants, if you will, that are not capable of rolling it up to the hyperscale providers.
Yeah, you mentioned orchestration. I thought that's probably the big elephant in the room. Really, is to get that orchestration set up so that the network seamlessly fails over into that net new world. I also think that we touched on RTO and RPO previously. I think for some smaller companies that are interested in DR that have RTOs that are extended, they can be down for a day, 2 days, what have you. DR is good. I mean, public cloud is a good option in that sense.
Yep.
Absolutely. Had a few other questions that came in. We're going to rapid fire real quick. How do I know if my DR plan is out of date?
I'll jump on that one. And so we're making the presumption that the DR plan is being tested, and that is, of course, the surefire way to know if it's out of date, if you will. Oftentimes, we can taking that one step farther, looking at it from an application perspective. A lot of commercial off-the-shelf application providers are migrating into software as a service or SaaS, and so, in other words, the application may not necessarily need to be installed on premises anymore. And so, there could be various changing elements. It's just like in the security sphere, where even though we're talking about disaster recovery, the people change, the processes change, and the tool availability changes as well. And so by constantly evaluating that through testing your plan, then effectively then those types of gaps can be uncovered.
And I see Joel Anderson, our VP of Marketing, has joined. He's probably going to give us the hook here in just a minute.
Great conversation.
A couple other rapid fire questions real quick that came in. DR is too expensive for our organization. This is an interesting question. What are some inexpensive methods I could use instead, or inexpensive methods I could utilize to protect our data instead? Any thoughts? Quick rapid fire.
Yeah, so I mean, there are things like Veeam Cloud Connect that effectively lets you take your backups, get them offsite, and then to be able to rehydrate and stand those up in someone else's infrastructure. Again, it's low cost, but generally speaking, your RTO and your RPO, in fact, it can be hard to orchestrate that. You're gonna, you can have it be cheap or you can have it be fast, but there's a balance that you need to make between them. That's one of the ways that people do it. You take backups like a Veeam Cloud Connect, gets it offsite for you pretty easily, but it's not as fast to stand up as some of the other alternatives.
And Jake, and we tell clients all the time, as you know, and Stephen and Alvaro can back me up on this, but the closer you get to zero on an RTO and RPO, the more expensive it gets. So there is a kind of a balancing act there of importance to the organization.
Yeah, you just beat me to that. And that is basically, how do you manage the expectations throughout an organization? Does everything have to be mission critical? In other words, if it's just if it's an all-in-one copier that scans images, is that really mission critical as opposed to something like payroll? And so a lot of times starting small and if cost is really that factor, then sometimes you have to be creative with it as well. In other words, maybe it's only a subset of maybe team leadership or something like that through maybe just department heads, just to get that skeleton up and going. So there's various elements. I thought the comment was spot on about leveraging some of the tools. And then, of course, at that point, it's just the expectations. What are we trying to protect? What makes prudent sense on the cost perspective on how do we do that? And then, of course, a lot of economy of scale can be gathered as well.
Absolutely.
Yep.
We're a few minutes over, guys. I wanted to thank individually Stephen, Alvaro, Derrick, and Eric. The expertise that you lent on today's panel was wonderful. Wanted to also mention to all of the attendees nationwide, I'm looking at some of these names and where you're from. Again, whether it's Seattle, San Diego, Philadelphia, or Miami, just know that the reason I started Tier 4 was truly to help offload a lot of the time and stress that's involved in these types of projects. We are 100% vendor agnostic. We're here to help any way we possibly can. And our team and our MO from the very beginning is to add value. And our team is here to do that for you and with you. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Joel to tie this up. Again, thank you for joining today's webinar. For those who were on last week's webinar, thank you for joining that as well. Look for the new release of next week's webinar coming shortly. And again, thank you so much to the panelists and all those who attended. Joel, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Jake. Again, phenomenal conversation. This could go on for probably hours and hours. A great topic to dive into maybe on a second or third go round. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining. If you have specific areas of interest or needs related to anything that was discussed today, feel free to reach out to a Tier 4 Advisors team member or one of our expert panelists. We'd love to be able to dive into that in greater detail with you. Also, look forward to our next webinar happening Wednesday next week, a panelist full of CIOs and how smart IT leaders prepare for and thrive during a recession. So great topic. A lot of people, thinking about how we prepare and keep that bottom line healthy. And so that will be the focus of next week. Look forward to seeing you all then. Take care. Have a great week. Thank you all.